Okay, juniors, we're going to introduce the Vietnam War here today on our Tuesday. Hope everybody's doing well. So, Vietnam War, again, this is another conflict that occurs during the Cold War era. Um, and it was, again, similar to the Korean War in a sense where the United States is going to become involved in a conflict in Southeastern Asia pertaining to the spread of communism. So, how we introduce this is so again, Vietnam is a southeastern Asian country, and what had happened is it had once been a colony of France. And so during World War II, France had lost control of Vietnam, or as they called it, Indochina. And after World War II has ended, France decides that they want to reclaim that lost territory. Japan had taken it during World War II. France, following World War II, decides that they want to reestablish their control and regain that territory. A couple of reasons for that. Obviously, countries don't like losing territory. And the other thing is that France also wanted to contain communism, kind of like what was going on in Europe and such. So they're going to fight this war against the Indo-Chinese, and the United States is going to support France. We're not going to provide them troops, but we're going to provide them supplies and such, right? The United States and Dwight Eisenhower at the time here in the early 1950s believed in what was called the domino theory. We've kind of talked about that before, where they felt like Southeastern Asia was kind of a domino with all these countries that are very, border each other pretty tightly, that if one nation had fallen to communism, others would fall too in turn. So like China, North Korea here had become communist, and the United States obviously wanted to do whatever they could to prevent that from happening in Vietnam, to prevent this domino theory. Okay. Well, this French Indochina War ends poorly for France. Eventually, the Viet Minh, as they were called, or at this point, I guess, not the Vietnam, but the Indochinese, the Vietnamese that live there, they're going to drive France out. And what's going to happen here in 1953, I believe was the year, is countries like the United States, the Soviet Union, Laos, Cambodia, that were also a part of Indochina, they're going to meet in Geneva, and they're going to sign what are called the Geneva Accords. And these Geneva Accords, what they're going to do is it's going to temporarily divide Vietnam into two nations, kind of like Korea. You're going to have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And there was this very influential political leader in Vietnam who had left during during World War II and during this French Indochina War. His name was Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh is going to bring communism back to Vietnam, and he's really kind of the founder of communism in Vietnam. He had studied in the Soviet Union and some other things like that. And he's going to be somebody that's very influential in trying to assert Vietnamese independence from France and at the same time trying to spread communism. So eventually what happens is Eisenhower and the Kennedy administrations going into through the 1950s into the 1960s, they're going to try to support the South Vietnam government as much as possible, just because Ho Chi Minh had such a strong following in the North. The United States is really going to try to support the South, where they had alleged, democracy and essentially a hand-picked leader to lead South Vietnam. The only issue in his name was Diem. That was his last name. And the United States backed him, despite the fact that the guy was super corrupt, not very organized. The people of South Vietnam really didn't like him, but he was not communist, so therefore the United States tried to support him the best they could between Eisenhower and Kennedy, and the phrase was kind of sink or swim with Diem, is that was their hope to prevent communism from spreading to South Vietnam. Well, what does start happening in South Vietnam is there's another organization that is referred to as the Viet Cong, and the Viet Cong was a communist organization within South Vietnam. And eventually what they start doing is they start assassinating various leaders of the South Vietnam government. And again, Viet Cong were communists. And they were directly supported by Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh, they had developed this series of paths and secret tunnels and such, where the Viet Cong were supplied with weapons from the north via what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Okay, that was kind of the supply routes that allowed the Viet Cong to gain possession of guns and ammo and weapons of war and such from the north and from Ho Chi Minh along this Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so finally what happens is in 1963, November of 1963, which is a really hard year, hard month, hard year, eventually the United States decides that DM has to go, that he is not stable enough. The government has not become stable. That was the promise he had made to the United States for support against the Viet Cong. And so the United States in 1963 kind of decides, the heck with this guy. And the United States actually, like the U.S. military, is going to lead a coup to overthrow DM. And eventually DM gets assassinated as a result of this, even though that was something the United States did not necessarily want. They just wanted the guy out of control of South Vietnam. And later on that month, on November 23rd, 1963, John F. Kennedy is going to get assassinated. And he had announced shortly before his assassination that he had intended to start pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam, because that was something here that became kind of a thing, is that the United States, as we were backing the South Vietnamese, what had happened is the United States kept sending more and more troops to South Vietnam, and Kennedy had promised that he was going to start withdrawing troops. He believed that this issue with communism in Vietnam was something that should be settled by the Vietnamese and not necessarily something by the United States. But again, Kennedy is assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, and following that, that's kind of where we see the escalation of war. Kennedy's vice president's name was Lyndon Baines Johnson, becomes president. He's going to serve the remainder of Kennedy's term and then get elected to one of his own. And Johnson, as far as Vietnam, he kind of made it his primary goal, or one of his primary goals, was to, as I say, win in Vietnam. In other words, to prevent the spread of communism in Vietnam. And Johnson, like John F. Kennedy, was a Democrat, and Democrats at this point in time in the 1960s had kind of taken a bad rap from the more so conservative crowd for being soft on communism. And Johnson really wanted to prove that he wasn't. He did not want to be the president, and there's memoirs out there where he basically says he did not want to be the president that had Vietnam, fall to communism on his watch. And so for that reason, from 1964 to 1968, 1969, we see a massive escalation of U.S. war efforts in Vietnam under the Johnson administration. He is the president that truly escalated our military personnel and our military involvement in Vietnam. And one of those first examples can be seen with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. This is something that in 1964, the U.S. military, which again had a presence in Vietnam, the U.S. Navy was out on a patrol trip kind of in the Tonkin Gulf, which is, further north and, just outside North Vietnam. And there was allegedly some torpedoes shot at one of the U.S. warships. The U.S. returned fire. Same thing happens a couple days later. There's more shots fired. The United States returns fire. And Johnson finds out about this, and he's like, well, hey, if the North Vietnamese are shooting at us, that's kind of an act of war. And so Johnson goes to Congress and basically asks for permission to have, whatever powers necessary to kind of put a stop to the North Vietnamese. And Congress is going to approve this resolution. And essentially what this allowed was for the Johnson administration to wage war without a formal declaration of war from Congress. And Congress never declares war during this Vietnam conflict. It was never an officially declared war. But by passing this Tonkin Gulf resolution, Congress basically authorized the president to do everything like it were if it were a declared war, from the resources that go into it, from the size of the army to, redoing fiscal policy to have more tax dollars to fight war. And the other thing about this, and that's what's really going to escalate it, but the other thing about this is Johnson had not told Congress about some of the other secret operations that had taken place before this, where maybe the United States had done some raids in North Vietnam and things like that. So that's going to become widely unpopular later. And one of these first big military operations that takes place shortly after the passage of this Tonkin Gulf resolution is Operation Rolling Thunder, which was a huge bombing operation in which the United States dropped many tons of bombs on North Vietnam. And I would also understand that this Tonkin Gulf resolution also allowed for more and more troops to be sent to South Vietnam. By 1965, there was nearly 200,000 troops. By 1967, 1968, there's going to be over 500,000 U.S. soldiers in South Vietnam, despite the fact that it was, agreed upon, and mentioned that this was a war that was really, and Johnson has said it too, that this was a war that should be decided by the people of Vietnam. But more to come on that. So what made fighting this conflict a little bit different is the South Vietnam Army was not super well trained, not super well organized. And that's I guess a big reason for why the United States brings in more troops. And the Viet Cong didn't really fight like other enemies that the U.S. military had fought before. They would hide in the jungles. They would sneak attack. They would hide like in public. They would use spies, and it became really difficult to fight the Viet Cong because the U.S. military didn't really know who they were fighting. They knew they were fighting the Viet Cong, but they didn't know who that was. So it kind of made it a really tough thing to fight. And the fact that the Viet Cong had started, digging all these tunnels and kind of hiding and then sneaking attack. And it made fighting this war different than fighting like a World War II, where the United States knew we were fighting the Japanese, we were fighting the Germans, the Italians. In this case, it was hard to figure out who the Viet Cong was, like who the actual personnel was that they were. So that kind of made this, a little bit different. Now, General William Westmoreland kind of becomes the commander here of the forces in South Vietnam, and his big plan to win the conflict was to increase the body count, basically to cause more death, more destruction, so that eventually the Viet Cong would just give up. And again, the United States was much more technologically advanced as far as weapons of war than the Viet Cong were, and they had the bombing and the airplanes, all these different weapons of war that they could use that the Viet Cong didn't really have. And so that was kind of his strategy, was just to induce as much destruction as they could to eventually give up, to hope that the Viet Cong would just simply give up. And the other thing too is that he also called for winning the hearts and minds of the rural population of South Vietnam, because they were the ones that were maybe in his mind more apt to become communist. And he said, if we can show them that we're here to help them and such, that maybe they will help us in return. So as far as U.S. tactics here in fighting as well, we talked a little bit about the Viet Cong. The United States starts the use of napalm, which is, again, a very destructive substance, combustible substance. It's basically a firebomb. And the United States started dropping these all in North Vietnam, caused a lot of civilian deaths as well. Women, children, people that maybe weren't necessarily involved. And even maybe what's a little bit better known with Vietnam is the United States, given the jungle conditions, started dropping tons of a herbicide that gets nicknamed Agent Orange. That Agent Orange as a herbicide would eat up any vegetation, including crops, with the idea of trying to bring the Viet Cong out from hiding and destroying some of that food supply necessary for the war effort. Agent Orange has since, it's been in the news a lot, or it's been found out with, potential side effects of being exposed to it, especially secondhand side effects. So something that the United States used in Vietnam. Now, as this goes on through the 1960s and the Johnson administration continues to up our escalation here, the morale of the U.S. troops kind of started to sink, given the fighting conditions, maybe the lack of headway that they were making against the Viet Cong. And the other thing here, too, is that while this is all going on, South Vietnam has its own other issues, where you have the Buddhist population that is really unhappy with the government. And you start seeing these protests where some of the Buddhist monks and such would burn themselves in public as like as a sign of their distaste for the South Vietnam government. And so that's also going on during this time. So there's a lot of other things, moving parts here too, with this civil war within a civil war, really. Now, kind of despite all this, a lot of, especially in the 1960s, a lot of the soldiers that get sent to Vietnam, they felt very strongly about their purpose there. A lot of their fathers and grandfathers and relatives had fought in World War II. And so they kind of had this sense of duty, patriotism, I guess, if you will. to be successful in containing communism. And that's what they were told they were doing, right? These members of the army, the armed forces, they were there to do a job that, the government had sent them to do, despite the fact that that purpose becomes maybe more, unpopular with the American public. A lot of the soldiers that went there, they felt strongly about, containing communism. Okay. Now, again, as far as the war at home within the United States, the war became more and more expensive as it went on. There was all kinds of issues with wartime inflation, which was a thing during World War I and World War II. The U.S. had to actually raise taxes. Johnson had to ask Congress to raise taxes so we had more revenue to fight the war. Upon doing that, the Republican-controlled Congress called for cuts in the Great Society program. So I had said earlier that winning the Vietnam War was one of Johnson's big priorities. The other big priority he had was what was called the Great Society program. Programs like Medicare, Medicaid, some of the different educational laws and such were a part of this. It was basically LBJ's domestic reform plan, to make the American society better by giving access to health care to more people and allowing for more educational opportunities and such. So those Great Society programs lose some funding, like $6 billion worth, which was kind of a big deal. And again, it was, LBJ takes oftentimes a negative rap for, Vietnam, but also for allowing this Great Society to become less well-funded because of wanting to fight a war in Vietnam. The other thing that made the Vietnam War very unique is that this was the first war in history where there was live news coverage of it. TV crews, camera crews from U.S. News outlets would follow troops around on patrol, and they would see the quote unquote the body count. They would also see U.S. troops being put into body bags too. So the American public got to see firsthand some of the things that was happening in Vietnam, and despite the fact that people like William Westmoreland and LBJ were saying, well, the United States is winning this. Like the United States, like the Viet Cong is going to fall very soon. The U.S. public kind of starts to question that a little bit. And there's kind of a credibility gap, I guess, that grows especially with Lyndon Johnson, where, again, Lyndon Johnson would oftentimes talk about how successful the military operations were going in Vietnam. But in reality, people started to question that if what he was saying was actually what was happening or not. And I guess history kind of shows us that maybe there was a credibility gap there, okay, potentially. And then you also see a growing opposition to the war in general, especially amongst young people. And we'll talk more about like the Kent State incident, some other things there too. But you see, especially the younger generation, the younger baby boomers, kind of becoming more politically involved, and you see a lot more of the public demonstrations that were protesting the Vietnam War. And that was something that, you hadn't seen a lot of that in U.S. history, because World War I, World War II, there was such a strong sense of beating the Germans or beating the Japanese or the Italians who had attacked us. And during Vietnam, what you see happen is you see this younger generation that really becomes more politically involved and expressing their distaste for the war and why the United States was there, and why, tens of thousands of young men were being sent off to fight a war and die for something that maybe did not affect the United States. But that's a little bit more here about the intro and the escalation of the Vietnam War. Please let me know if you have any questions.